What's going on, everyone? So I got an exciting deck today. We're talking about Han Aggro, a little bit different than the normal casino Han list that you'll be seeing out there, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But before I dive into the deck today, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone. We're actually almost at 1,000 subscribers, which actually unlocks a few things on YouTube for me. So if you all are interested in the deck techs and the videos every single day, be sure to sub, because I think we're only, again, about 120 away as of recording, which is pretty sweet. But let's start off with Han Aggro, talking about Han himself. Now, the idea behind this deck is to benefit from Han's leader ability and action while not succumbing to the extremely RNG / inconsistent games that you're going to be finding with the more casino Han. And when I refer to casino Han, I'm talking about the decks that run basically 18 to 21 to even 24 copies of some of the best 7-drops in the game. We're talking about things like Mace Windu, U-Wing reinforcements, Count Dooku, Han Solo, the creature version, all that type of stuff, so that you can really benefit, since on turn 5 or turn 4 you could deploy a 7-drop. You put an action or a resource down from your hand with the action, you deploy Han, because then you have 6 resources, and then you attack, which gives you another resource off Han, giving you that 7 resources. This deck instead is leveraging the fact that we get to play a turn ahead of everyone and just beat them down with our better units. Sometimes deploying multiple 2-drops a turn ahead, or just deploying a 3-drop on turn 1, followed by a 4-drop, followed by a 5-drop, and then potentially a 7-drop on that critical turn. And so right here with the action ability, this is something that you kind of just want to do 1 to 2 times within the first 2 to 3 rounds of the game. On turn 1, if you don't have a 3-drop to deploy, you probably are mulling that hand, because we have a lot of 3-drops to make it so that we can play a curve ahead, either trading into our opponent's units very quickly, or just beating them down with our superior units. And then when we do get to that flip side on Han, he is a 4/6, which is actually pretty respectable, but this also allows us to potentially play, as I mentioned, that same casino Han type thing, but instead of like relying on us, making sure we get our 7-drop when we want it and be able to have those early plays, we just get to play the good 7-drops that we have in our colors without that big downside. So we're really just being more consistent, more aggressive, and getting a lot of value that way. Now, I have fiddled with like Han Blue, Han Red, because there's obviously different 7-drops that you could play in those colors, but Han Green was by far the most interesting and, in my opinion, best performing, at least in the matches that I've played so far. I guess not my opinion, but in the matches that I've played so far, specifically because you have access to ECL and you have access to a lot of the really powerful green heroism cards, such as something as simple as Battlefield Marine, but also something as, well, impressive as like U-Wing reinforcement. So green, definitely solid. I want to try a Han Red list, kind of following the same strategy, but I think that Han Green is a little bit better position. With that said, let's dive into the ground units, which really highlight some of the very powerful things we could be doing a turn ahead. So with our ground units here, you might notice that this is a very, very typical yellow-green rebel aggro shell. So if you play like Leia Yellow, which is pretty solid, then you'll see a lot of these same units. But it's very, very important to note that we have a pretty sizable amount of 3-drops in the deck, and actually not too many 2-drops. And the main reason for that is our 2-drops kind of want to be played on a turn that we can either take advantage of multiple 2-drops or like a 3-drop and a 2-drop, whereas the 3-drops, we can just play them on turn 1. But with that said, we have 3 copies of Lawful Insurgent or Lethal Insurgent here. This is just a really nice kind of secondary play after you've gone ahead and placed your other 2-drop or potentially your 3-drop a little bit later on, because you will almost always be playing this when you can get effect out of the when played ability. You can actually start to mess up players, but to be honest, it's just a solid body. It does die to some of the 2 power units, but it always seems to trade in within the first 1 to 2 turns. 3 copies of Battlefield Marine. These are the only 2-drops that are running in the deck, or 2 resource units. And the main reason is because, well, we have 3 power and they give us something to do when we may not have a resource available to us, or we can make multiple plays in a turn. And these are the best options as far as I've found. We are not running things like R2 or C3PO because these are value generating engines, and we're trying to just beat down our opponent before they can really get a lot of stuff down. 3 copies of Echo Base Defender is our first 3 resource unit. This one's really nice, especially in the aggro matchup, as unless they play some sort of 3 powered unit, and maybe they can potentially trade up by using something like shoot first or something, they have to attack into this and trade off their units. So there's almost never a situation where they're going to be able to remove your Echo Base Defender without, you know, interacting with it some way. So it saves you a lot of HP. And if they go for space, well, there's no space unit on turn 1 that has as much power as an Echo Base Defender. So you just start to outrace them on turn 1. We also have 3 copies of Ezra Bridger. Now, this is one of those decks where I really like Ezra because you can actually take advantage of the additional resources and additional card selection / advantage that Ezra is going to be bringing. Because if you get a nice cast, like let's say you can tag into, or you can reveal into something like a Fleet Lieutenant or Echo Base Defender or Battlefield Marine on top, you're going to be able to potentially play multiple spells because of Han's action. So that could be really nice. And then we have 3 copies of Fleet Lieutenants. Basically everything is a rebel, so we can get that extra power in. We have 3 copies of Rogue Operative, another 4 power unit on turn 1, which is really nice. And this one in particular has 4 toughness, which means that there are very few units that could trade into this profitably on turn 1. If you think about all the most popular like aggro or even non-aggro units that people are playing, this just trades up. Think about like Crafty Smuggler. Think about, you know, Battlefield Marine. Think about Lawful Insurgent. Think about Sabine. All of those just die to this very simply. We also, as our first 4-drop in the deck, have 3 copies of General Dodonna. Now, General Dodonna is really interesting because in other decks, General Dodonna is oftentimes the main target. But when you're playing a turn ahead, essentially, you can really get a lot more advantage out of General Dodonna than you otherwise would be able to in other decks. So, for example, if you go turn 1 Ezra Bridger, turn 2, you can action your your Han, and then ECL out something like a General Dodonna potentially, so you could trade into one of their units, so you get value out of General Dodonna, and you get the pump on Ezra, so then you can potentially trade into another unit or just take advantage of the +1/+1. And now they either have to, you know, trade into their General Dodonna, which is really nice for you because you kind of got a 2-for-1 with pumping your units, or you could just have it sit on the battlefield and get you a lot of value. Again, being able to play a turn ahead in the aggro matchup, or in an aggro deck I should say, is really powerful. And this works really well even against something like Boba Fett, because, well, getting a 4/4 on the battlefield is something they cannot deal with on turn 2 unless they would like to waylay your unit. And if that's the case, well, they're waylaying without much pressure on the battlefield. 3 copies of Steadfast Battalion. I really like this one. One, we have ECL, so it can synergize with that, but playing a 5/5 with Overwhelm again on like turn 3, when you could deploy Han and then a 7-drop directly after that, is ridiculously powerful, because you will get Steadfast Battalion down before they can oftentimes deal with this unit. They either have to have something like Takedown or something like Surprise Strike, and even if they're Surprise Striking your Steadfast Battalion, you are now trading Surprise Strike plus that unit for your Steadfast Battalion that you just played a turn early, which is pretty nice. And lastly, with 3 copies of Han Solo, mainly because, well, we will hit those 7-drops immediately on turn 5 usually, or turn 4 rather, because we're going to action out that resource, give it up to 6 resources, deploy Han, and then be able to get another resource, which allows us to cast things like Han Solo. And while you might think, oh, well, isn't a 6/6, 7 resource kind of mediocre? Do not underestimate something like Han Solo. He may not be a rebel. He may not have like the most immediate impact to damage your opponent's base, but being able to ambush something and then keep it as a 6/6 is really powerful. Again, we're playing essentially with Han Solo 2 turns ahead when we're considering 7 drops. So that's really nice. That's going to round out our ground units. Let's talk about the space and, of course, eventually get up to the events and upgrades. So the space units are kind of the reason why this deck is immensely powerful, especially against the early aggressive decks or even the Boba decks, because Millennium Falcon just cleans house. And it is extremely good with Han specifically, but as just a unit itself, if they go like turn 1 TIE Fighter, turn 1 Cartel Spacer, which is a 2/3 in space, or turn 1 A-Wing, which is a 1/3 with Raid 2, or turn 1 X-Wing, which is a 2/3 in the space, all of those units just straight up die to Millennium Falcon, and Millennium Falcon gets to stay around on turn 1 because you get to action your hand, play a Millennium Falcon, kill their units, and then boom, you get to keep your Millennium Falcon. Even better, in this deck specifically, there is an interaction where you do not need to worry about the downside of Millennium Falcon. Now, if you choose to, you could always just return it to your hand if you think it's going to die or someone's going to steal it, right? Which kind of sucks. But what this card says is when you ready cards during the regroup phase, you must pay 1 or return it to the hand. Now, what Han's action ability says is defeat a resource you control at the start of the next action phase. So the way this works is in Star Wars Unlimited, you have your phases where you go through the regroup phase and you draw your cards, you resource your whatever you want to. If you choose not to, you can choose not to. Then you ready your cards, and then the action phase begins. Now, the way this works is you are able to pay the 1 with the resource that you will have to defeat at the start of the next action phase, meaning that the downside for Millennium Falcon is essentially 0. Very powerful 1-drop, and the thing you want to see on turn 1 basically every single game. We also have 3 copies of Wing Leader. Now, it's important to note Wing Leader does not work with Han because he is not a rebel unit, but it also works with basically every other unit that we have, with the exception of Han, and then Steadfast Battalion, Han Solo, Millennium Falcon. Those are the copies that don't work with Wing Leader. So there are some times when you do want to resource it, but it is very good to follow up something like, okay, turn 1, Ezra Bridger. Turn 2, maybe you don't need to use your action ability from Han because you want to keep your cards in hand for a later turn, and you just play a Wing Leader, and now you have a 5/6 on the battlefield because your unit was already overstatted, and that can be really difficult to deal with because when you start to just overstat your units to the next level, a lot of the down-to-earth, low-to-the-ground, aggressive decks just cannot deal with that, and you can just start killing off their units one by one by one by one. Of course, if you're fighting against like Boba or some units with, or some decks with like Traitorous or Waylay, this could be a lot more risky, so just be aware of that. 3 copies of Bright Hope. This is also really powerful for not only the 2/6 Sentinel body, which helps you again defend in space. You're not every game going to have Millennium Falcon, so you do want to have a little bit more space presence, but you could also benefit from returning something like a General Dodonna or a Fleet Lieutenant to hand, because unlike most other decks, Han is a deck that actually does benefit from additional cards in hand because it allows you to resource them down with his action ability. So there are a lot of times when I've decided to resource or return a Fleet Lieutenant or a General Dodonna to hand so that I keep them alive. And potentially, if you've kept ECL out, right, you could even return something like a Steadfast Battalion, which you've already got an attack with. Like, let's say you attack in with Steadfast Battalion, it takes 6 damage, but you gave it +2/+2. Well, now you can return it to hand, right? Which keeps it alive essentially, and then you might be able to just ECL out it again. There's a lot of situations like that, which makes Bright Hope quite solid. And again, it's just a 2/6 with Sentinel, which is very, very powerful as well. But let's talk about some of the more exciting parts of playing yellow specifically and Han together in the events. So starting us off here in the events category, we have 2 copies of Shoot First. This is really powerful again because we are playing way better statted units on turn 1. We will get a lot of value out of just killing off their potentially 5 toughness units, right? We have things like Echo Base Defender and Rogue Operative that will just kill off things like Boba Fett on turn 2, which you can easily do. We have 3 copies of Surprise Strike, which is just a really nice aggressive card. And yet again, because we have very high toughness units on turn 1, basically no one has less than 3 toughness with the exception of Lothal Insurgents, you can get a lot of value, or you can just attack in for big chunks of damage. We have 2 copies of Change of Heart. This can be a nasty, nasty play because remember, this can come down the same time you're playing your Han Solo, right? So you can go, instead of playing your 7-drop, let's say, you can go turn 4, you action Han, you then can Change of Heart and deploy Han, and that can sometimes just win the game right there. That amount of damage coming out, especially if you're, right, playing against another aggressive deck, or maybe another heroism deck, and you're getting your own General Dodonna buffed, or your units buffed by your own General Dodonna, right? That could be really powerful. Or you could be taking their Steadfast Battalion, or maybe their Boba Fett, or whatever it is. It can just swing the game's ridiculous amounts. A very powerful event. We also have 3 copies of Cunning. Now, normally, I do not like playing these double aspect cards in a lot of the decks because the extra 2 cost is just not good enough. But because we're playing a more aggressive deck that is able to cheat the curve, you can kind of look at Cunning as more of a 5 costed event in this deck, even though it still is technically 6 costed, because the ability to bounce something, so just a slightly better waylay, combined with, or a slightly worse waylay, I should say, combined with a +4/+0, so a slightly better surprise strike, combined with, you know, the ability to potentially exhaust so you can have that tempo play, is just really powerful. And especially against other aggressive decks, this can swing the race in your favor drastically. If they have 3 units on the battlefield, let's say they even have initiative, they attack with 1, you exhaust 2, you give +4/+0, and suddenly you're swinging for, well, let's say, I don't know, you have something that you've played 4, 3, 4, and 5 mana up until that point. You might have like an Ezra Bridger, a General Dodonna, a Steadfast Battalion, or whatever. It doesn't matter. You just have an absurd amount of power. And again, you could deploy Han directly after this, so you can get into this big swing, big massive chunk of damage that allows you to even potentially play shoot first directly after, which is pretty nice. 3 copies of U-Wing Reinforcement. This is just a really powerful 7 drop that you can play again on that turn 4. That potentially gives you something like a Fleet Lieutenant General Dodonna, or like an Echo Base Defender, Battlefield Marine Lethal Insurgent. Really powerful. Keep in mind that it does not need to be any specific type. It is just 3 units with combined cost 7 or less. So you can grab Han, you can grab Steadfast Battalion, you can grab your Millennium Falcon, you can grab whatever you wish to grab. And if you grab something like a Steadfast Battalion, remember, you're gonna have your leader on the battlefield because that's when U-Wing's gonna come down for the most part. Or you could just grab things like, well, Bright Hope Wing Leader and just make a 4/8 in space. There are just so many different options, and this is one of the most swingy plays in the entire game, especially since, well, if you get your U-Wing down while you have at least 1 or 2 units, you could start doing things like, again, Fleet Lieutenanting, General Dodonning, which is really, really scary. And lastly, we have 1 copy of Traitorous. This has been just really powerful as a spell, and I find that when you can play it, not only your own units a turn ahead, but then get to counter by having potentially 3 drops, and they have nothing on the battlefield, that could be pretty devastating, right? You go turn 1 like Ezra Bridger. Turn 2, you play a 4-costed unit, and you take initiative. Turn 3, you get a Traitorous, whatever they played on turn 3. It can be really powerful, especially against Boba and against the aggro decks. Of course, there's only 1 copy because there are sometimes when it is pretty mediocre, but definitely a very powerful list. And again, we are going full aggro, benefiting from being able to play a turn ahead. Let's talk about the sideboard now. So with our sideboard here, we're going to start off with 3 copies of Chewbacca. Now, Chewbacca is really, really impressive. Again, this guy comes down on turn 3 in this deck. And he is just absolutely annoying to deal with when you're trying to play some sort of aggressive strategy, because not only are you able to prevent damage coming at you, and the 3 power oftentimes at that point in the game, right? Again, they're only going to have 4 resources. So they could play like General Dodonna, they could play like a K2 or whatever. But at that point in the game, they're not going to be able to just get free damage in on Chewbacca for the most part. If they're going to hit him, then either they're trading it, or it's going to be kind of like a pretty even trade with the ability for you to immediately attack back. So you've saved HP and you got to attack back, which gives you the advantage in the race. We have 2 copies of Rogue Squadron Skirmisher. Again, these more expensive cards that I don't like in other versions of other decks because it takes too long to get the value. This one in particular actually gets value way earlier because you could play it well on turn 4, which is really, really nice. So ambushing actually is relevant because they're going to probably have something that you can ambush, and this could be really nice, especially against the aggro decks. 3 copies of Asteroid Sanctuary. This is really nice against anyone that's trying to trade in with your units because, well, you're going to be able to give that shield token to units you really do want to protect. I found that even though, you know, Boba does have waylays and things like that, Asteroid Sanctuary can really be devastating, because one of the big things that they have in terms of advantage is the ability to use their own shields to their advantage. So either they're going to waylay it and you've traded up on resources because you have played a 2 costed event and they've played a 3 costed event, and you've been able to exhaust their units so you've saved damage, or they're just going to have to trade with it in terms of shields. And this also works really nice against things like enemy Bobas, enemy Boba turns, or even enemy Han Solo turns, which can be really nice. 2 copies of Traitors to finish it off, and this is really important against your Boba strategies, at least from what I've found. Again, taking control of things like Crafty Smuggler and things like Boba Fett are extremely relevant, because there are a lot of Boba decks which rely on early creatures to benefit from their early events, because if they're playing the tempo game with no units on the battlefield, then they're kind of just playing a really bad, mediocre control deck. So that is going to be the entire list here. I hope you all enjoyed. And again, this is a very, very interesting aggro deck, because you're playing just big units. It's almost like playing, for those of you who play Magic, like Big Red is kind of how this reminds me of, or what this reminds me of, because you're just playing big things, but a turn ahead, because you're able to from Han's action. It's really powerful, and some decks just aren't able to deal with all the impressively statted units. Like, you could just trade off if you wanted to with every one of their units basically, and they will not be able to do anything, because you're playing 4/4s and 5/5s and 3/4s, while they're playing 3/2s, 2/2s, 2/3s and such. So really, really powerful, and honestly, a lot of fun. It is just fun to use Han. You don't have to do the casino thing. You can always just play this U-Wing reinforcements and the Han Solos in Han Solo without risking your entire hand being Count Dooku's, Mace Windu's, and other uncastable cards that you'll never be able to play. There are some modifications you can make to this deck if you are interested in incorporating a little bit more of that Casino Han look. My suggestion is to potentially take out things like Cunning and Wing Leader, and maybe add in things like Luke Skywalker or, you know, Mace Windu's. Those are the 2 of my favorites, because they both either are going to immediately impact the board and do something impressive with really good stats, or they're just immediately able to deal damage to your opponent in Mace Windu's. So I've tried that, and that could be really strong, but this is much more consistent, and you don't have to worry about, you know, completely screwing over your hand by drawing a million 7-drops because you just have a nice curve with Han. So thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I will see you all for the next one.